It took 3 days for the panic to begin. The intelligence agencies of 12 different species detected the movement at almost the same time. The Terran Third Fleet, 62 warships strong, had left Callaway Base and was repositioning toward the Orion Vale border. They were not hiding. Their transponders were active, their formation was standard patrol configuration, and they had not powered up weapons. But they were moving, and that was enough. On Threshold Station, the mood shifted overnight. Delegates who had voted to strip humanity's colonization rights now walked the corridors with tight expressions and lowered voices. It was one thing to vote against a young species in the comfort of a council chamber. It was another thing entirely to see that species put warships in motion. Ambassador Zorath Vel refused to show concern. He held a private meeting in a sealed chamber deep inside the Cathari diplomatic wing, where the walls were lined with sound-dampening material, and the air was kept at the dry, warm temperature his species preferred. 2 other delegates sat across from him. The first was a representative of the Halori Collective, not a single being, but a cluster of crystalline nodes arranged in a vaguely humanoid shape, each node flickering with pale blue light. The Halori were a silicon-based hive mind, and their military strength came from vast fleets of autonomous drone fighters controlled by a central intelligence. They did not feel fear in the way organic species did, but they understood threat calculations perfectly well. The second was Trade Lord Shenik of the Varani Trade Empire. Shenik was reptilian, with smooth olive-green scales and sharp golden eyes that never seemed to blink. The Varani were merchants above all else, and their warships existed primarily to protect trade routes. Shenik had supported the vote not out of fear of humanity, but because Zorath Vel had promised that Varani trading companies would receive preferred access to the Orion Vale's resources once the humans were pushed out. "We must act now," Zorath Vel said, leaning forward on his long segmented legs. "The humans are posturing. They are bluffing. But if we allow them to bluff successfully, other species will see it as weakness on our part." "What do you propose?" the Halori representative asked. Its voice was a harmonic chord produced by the vibration of its crystal nodes, beautiful and deeply unsettling at the same time. "A joint fleet, Cathari warships, Halori drone carriers, and Varani escort cruisers. We position them at the Orion Vale and establish a blockade around the human colonies there. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out. The humans will have no choice but to negotiate on our terms." Trade Lord Shenik's eyes narrowed. "A blockade is an act of war." "A blockade is a statement of authority," Zorath Vel corrected smoothly. "The Council has ruled. The humans are defying that ruling. We are simply enforcing it." Shenik was not convinced, but he was not brave enough to say no. The Cathari were powerful allies and dangerous enemies. He agreed to send a detachment of escort cruisers, though he made it clear they were for defensive purposes only. Zorath Vel accepted the condition with a thin smile that Shenik did not trust at all. While the Cathari built their coalition in secret, Megan Cole was building one of her own. She worked from a small office on the lower levels of Threshold Station, far from the grand diplomatic suites. The room was plain: a desk, 2 chairs, a secure communications terminal, and a window that looked out into the vast interior of the station. She preferred it this way. Grand offices attracted attention, and attention was the last thing she needed right now. Over the course of 4 days, she held quiet meetings with 6 different delegations. She was careful about who she approached. She chose species that were young enough to resent the elder races, but old enough to have real influence. The most important meeting was with the Dravasi. The Dravasi were a canine-like species, tall, muscular, covered in short gray fur, with powerful jaws and sharp amber eyes. They were warriors by culture and tradition, and they respected strength above all else. Their delegate to the council was War Chief Katon, a grizzled veteran with scars running across his muzzle, and one ear that had been torn half away in combat decades ago. Megan met him in a neutral location, a small observation lounge overlooking the nebula that surrounded Threshold Station. Katon arrived alone, which was a sign of respect. Among the Dravosi, meeting someone without guards meant you considered them worthy of trust. "War Chief," Megan said, standing to greet him. "Thank you for coming." Katon sat down heavily. He was old for a Dravosi, and his joints ached in the station's artificial gravity. "Your message was interesting, Ambassador. You said you had information I would want to see." Megan placed a small data device on the table between them and activated it. A holographic display showed a series of intercepted communications. Cathari diplomatic traffic, carefully decoded by Terran intelligence. The Cathari knew the Orion Veil was rich in Veilithium before the vote ever happened, Megan said. The entire motion to strip our colonization rights was a resource grab. They used the Council as a tool to steal what they could not take by force. Katon studied the data in silence for a long time. His amber eyes moved slowly across each document. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "I fought beside your soldiers once," he said. 6 years ago, at the Rathani border, when the pirates hit that convoy. Your people were outnumbered and outgunned, and they did not run. They held the line until my ships arrived." He paused. "I remember what your commander said to me afterward. She said thank you, and then she asked if my crew needed medical attention before her own wounded had been treated." Megan nodded. She knew the story. Every Terran diplomat assigned to the Council knew it. That single act of selflessness had earned humanity more goodwill with the Dravasi than 100 trade agreements. "My people do not forget such things," Katon said. "Show me what you need." Megan also met with the Palathi, a small avian species barely 4 feet tall, with bright plumage and quick darting eyes. They were engineers and builders, responsible for designing and maintaining much of the infrastructure on Threshold Station itself. They had little military power, but they had something just as valuable: information. The Palathi knew every system on the station, every communication relay, every maintenance tunnel, and they were very good at listening. The Palathi delegate, a nervous but brilliant female named Tyveen, agreed to share intelligence about Cathari fleet movements in exchange for a future engineering partnership with Terran shipyards. Megan accepted immediately. Meanwhile, on Earth, Admiral Sam Grady was making preparations of his own. He sat in a secure briefing room at Fleet Command in Colorado Springs, across from a man he had not seen in 3 years. Colonel Danny Harmon was 51 years old, with sun-weathered skin, a square jaw, and the kind of quiet intensity that made people pay attention even when he was not speaking. He had retired from the Terran Special Operations Division after 25 years of service, and had spent the last 3 years on a small ranch in Montana, raising horses, and trying very hard not to think about the things he had done during his career. "I would not ask if it was not serious, Danny," Grady said. Harmon looked at the briefing file on the table. He had already read it twice. The Cathari Coalition, the blockade preparations, the fleet movements, all of it pointed in one direction. "You think it is going to go hot," Harmon said. "It was not a question. I think we need to be ready if it does. I need someone who can plan for the worst and hope for the best, someone who doesn't panic." Harmon closed the file and looked out the window. The mountains were visible in the distance, covered in snow. He thought about his horses and his quiet mornings and the peace he had worked so hard to find. Then he thought about 2 million people on 3 colony worlds who were about to have a fleet of alien warships pointed at them. "When do I start?" he asked. Grady allowed himself a small smile. "You already have." 4 days later, Terran intelligence intercepted a transmission that changed everything. The Cathari Coalition fleet was not just forming, it was already in transit. Over 100 warships, including Halori drone carriers capable of deploying thousands of autonomous fighters, were heading for the Orion Veil. Their estimated arrival was less than 2 weeks away. Megan Cole received the news in her small office on Threshold Station. She stared at the data for a full minute without moving. Then she opened a secure channel to President Beckett on Earth. "They are not just sanctioning us," she said. "They are coming for our people." There was a long silence on the other end. When Beckett finally spoke, her voice was steady and cold in a way that Megan had never heard before. "Then we will be there when they arrive." The blockade arrived on a Tuesday, as measured by Earth Standard Time. Not that it mattered what day it was. What mattered was that 114 alien warships dropped out of faster-than-light transit and arranged themselves in a wide arc around 3 human colony worlds in the Orion Veil sector. And just like that, 2 million people were trapped. Emergency shelters had been prepared. Schools had run evacuation drills without telling the children exactly why. The adults knew, though. They could feel it in the air, that particular heaviness that settles over a community when something bad is coming, and there is nothing to do but wait. On Haven's Rest, a farmer named Ben Walsh stood in his field and watched the sky. It was early morning, and the sun was just coming up over the eastern hills, painting the clouds in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere up there, hidden by the brightness of the atmosphere, alien warships were orbiting his world. His 8-year-old daughter Katie was still asleep in the farmhouse behind him. He had not told her about the blockade yet. He did not know how to explain to a child that creatures from another star system had decided her home did not belong to her. He went back inside and made breakfast. There was nothing else to do. In orbit above Haven's Rest, the Cathari fleet commander, Vekthari Os, surveyed his forces with satisfaction. Os was a career military officer, disciplined, experienced, and loyal to the Dominion above all else. His flagship, a massive dreadnought called the Spine of Cathar, anchored the center of the blockade formation. Flanking him were 6 Halori drone carriers, each one capable of deploying 500 autonomous fighters. Behind them, a screening force of Varani escort cruisers maintained a loose perimeter. Oz had expected the humans to send angry messages. He had expected diplomatic threats and stern warnings. What he had not expected was what actually happened, which was nothing. The human colonies below him went about their daily routines as if 100 warships were not hanging over their heads. No evacuation attempts, no distress signals, no begging. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. On Earth, President Laura Beckett stood before a camera in the Oval Command Room and addressed the Terran Federation. The broadcast was sent on every frequency, military, civilian, and diplomatic, so that every species in the galaxy with a receiver could hear it. She wore a simple dark suit. No medals, no insignia, no symbols of military power. She looked directly into the camera and spoke in a voice that was calm and clear, and carried the weight of absolute certainty. Citizens of the Terran Federation, allies and observers across the galaxy, I speak to you today because a foreign military force has established a blockade around 3 of our colony worlds in the Orion Veil sector. Over 2 million of our people, civilians, families, children, are now cut off from supply lines and surrounded by warships. This action was not provoked. Our colonies were built lawfully, on worlds that were unsettled and unclaimed. The people who live there are farmers, builders, teachers, and dreamers. They went to the stars because humanity has always gone to the places where the horizon is farthest away. I will not raise my voice. I will not make threats. I will simply state a fact. The citizens of the Orion Veil colonies are under the protection of the United Terran Federation, and that protection is not conditional. It does not depend on the approval of the Galactic Council. It does not bend to the ambitions of any foreign power. To the commanders of the Coalition fleet, you have 72 standard hours to power down your weapons and withdraw from Terran-claimed space. This is a request made in good faith and with the sincere hope that it will be accepted. To the people of Haven's Rest, Ember Ridge, and Pale Shore, you are not alone. You have never been alone. We are coming. She held the camera's gaze for one more second. Then the broadcast ended. Across the galaxy, the reaction was immediate. On Threshold Station, delegates crowded around display screens, arguing and shouting. The Novori Ascendants, a cautious and ancient species that rarely involved itself in conflicts, issued a neutral statement calling for restraint on all sides. The Palathi delegate Tivine quietly forwarded the broadcast to every engineering guild in her species, along with a note that read simply, "Watch this one." Ambassador Zorath Vel watched the broadcast in his quarters and laughed. He called it theater. He called it the desperate posturing of a species that had no real power. He told his aides that the humans would let the deadline pass and then come crawling to the negotiating table. He was wrong about every single part of that. While the galaxy debated, Colonel Danny Harmon was already inside the blockade zone. He had arrived 3 days before the Coalition fleet, traveling aboard a stealth reconnaissance frigate so small and so quiet that it could drift within sensor range of a Kethari dreadnought without being detected. 5 more frigates had entered the zone through different vectors, each one crewed by a hand-picked team of specialists. Harmon's operations officer was a young woman named Lieutenant Nora Perry. She was 29 years old, with short red hair and a mind that worked like a targeting computer, fast, precise, and completely without hesitation. She had graduated first in her class from the Terran Naval Academy, and had turned down a comfortable posting at Fleet Command to serve in the field. Harmon had picked her personally because he needed someone who could see a battlefield the way a chess player sees a board, and Perry was the best he had ever met. From their hidden position behind the second moon of Haven's Rest, Perry mapped the entire Coalition fleet, every ship, every patrol route, every shift change, every gap in sensor coverage. She fed the data through quantum-encrypted channels back to Admiral Grady aboard the TFS Resolute, which was holding position with the Third Fleet just outside the Orion Vale border. Their formation is textbook Kethari doctrine, Perry told Harmon on the third night, her face lit by the blue glow of her tactical display. Heavy capital ships in the center, drone carriers behind, screening elements on the flanks. It is solid against a frontal assault. But, Harmon asked. He could hear the but in her voice. But it assumes they are facing one fleet from one direction. They have almost no rear coverage. The Halori drones are networked through 3 central relay nodes. Take out those nodes, and their entire drone fleet goes dark. And the Varani ships on the perimeter are running with half-powered shields. They do not want to be here. Harmon allowed himself a thin smile. Good. Keep mapping. I want to know where every single ship is at every single second. Meanwhile, on Threshold Station, Megan Cole played her final card. She requested an emergency session of the Galactic Council and stood before the full assembly with a data package that Terran intelligence had spent weeks assembling. It contained intercepted Kethari communications, proving beyond any doubt that the Orion Vale vote had been orchestrated from the beginning. The Kethari had conducted secret geological surveys of the region months before proposing the sanctions. The Valithium deposits alone were worth more than the combined gross product of 30 mid-tier civilizations. The entire thing had been a heist dressed up as policy. The chamber erupted. Delegates screamed accusations across the aisles. 3 species formally withdrew their support from the Kethari motion on the spot. The Palathi engineering guilds released a joint statement condemning the manipulation. And Trade Lord Shenik, who had already been uneasy about the entire arrangement, made a decision. He opened a channel to his escort cruisers in the Orion Vale, and ordered them to withdraw from the blockade immediately. The Varani had no interest in dying for someone else's lie. Zorath Vel watched his coalition crack, with fury in his eyes, but he did not waver. The Cathari fleet was still strong. The Hilori drones were still active. The blockade would hold. On Earth, the 72-hour clock was counting down. In the Oval Command Room, President Beckett sat across from a live holographic feed of Admiral Grady on the bridge of the TFS Resolute. "The Varani are pulling out," Grady reported. "That leaves the Cathari and Hilori. Still over 80 warships and roughly 3,000 drones." "And us?" Beckett asked. "The 5th Fleet arrived at Rally Point 6 hours ago. The 7th Fleet will be in position by tomorrow. Combined with the 3rd, we will have over 800 warships ready to move on your order." Beckett closed her eyes for just a moment. 800 warships, tens of thousands of crew members, all of them waiting for her to say a single word. "Are we ready, Sam?" she asked quietly. Admiral Grady looked at her through the holographic display. His face was calm, his voice steady, and his eyes held something that was not quite anger and not quite pride, but was somewhere in between. "We have been ready since the day they told us we did not belong here." Beckett opened her eyes and nodded once. "Then let us show them where we belong." The 72 hours passed. The Cathari did not withdraw. Vectharios sent a brief reply on an open channel stating that the coalition fleet was enforcing a lawful council resolution and would remain in position until the humans accepted the ruling. His tone was polite. His meaning was not. And then 6 minutes after the deadline expired, Earth went silent. It happened all at once, across every frequency and every channel. Terran diplomatic communications stopped. Trade networks went dark. Civilian broadcast stations that had been streaming news and entertainment to half the galaxy suddenly cut to static. Military channels that foreign intelligence agencies had been monitoring for weeks simply ceased to exist. In the span of a single minute, the entire human civilization vanished from the galactic communication grid. The first species to notice was the Varani, because they were in the middle of processing a trade shipment with a Terran cargo company when the signal dropped. The Varani communications officer tried to reconnect 17 times before reporting the failure up the chain. Within the hour, every species with an interest in human affairs was trying to reach Earth, and none of them could. On Threshold Station, the reaction was confusion first, then concern, then something that looked very much like fear. Delegates crowded the communication center, demanding answers that nobody had. The Hilori Collective ran diagnostic sweeps across every relay and range, and found nothing wrong with the equipment. They were simply gone, as if someone had reached into the network and pulled out every human thread in a single motion. Ambassador Zorath Vel stood in the corridor outside the council chamber, and told anyone who would listen that the humans had obviously surrendered. Their government had collapsed under the pressure, he said. Their military had stood down. The silence was the sound of a species accepting its place. Some delegates believed him. Most did not. There was something about the completeness of the silence that felt deliberate. Not the chaotic quiet of a system falling apart, but the focused silence of a system shutting down on purpose. High Speaker Draven called an emergency session. The ancient amphibian moved slowly to the central platform. He was over 900 years old, and every one of those years showed in the deep lines of his face and the careful way he placed each foot. But his golden eyes were sharp, and when he spoke, the chamber went still. "I have lived a very long time," Draven said. "I have watched civilizations rise from their first fires and fall to their last embers. I have seen 47 species go to war in this galaxy." He paused and looked out across the assembly, with an expression that was not quite fear, but was certainly not comfort. The loud ones are not the dangerous ones. The ones who boast and threaten and shake their weapons in the air, they are performing. They want you to be afraid, because your fear is their power. He let the silence stretch. The dangerous ones go quiet. They stop talking, because they no longer need to. They have made their decision, and words are no longer useful to them. He looked directly at Zorath Vel. The humans have gone quiet, Ambassador. I do not think that means what you think it means. Zorath Vel said nothing. For the first time since this crisis began, he had nothing to say. What was actually happening was a military protocol called Obsidian. It had been developed 30 years ago by Terran strategic planners who understood that in a galaxy full of species with advanced surveillance technology, the ability to disappear was just as valuable as the ability to fight. Protocol Obsidian was simple in concept and staggeringly complex in execution. Every Terran ship, station, colony, and satellite switched simultaneously from standard communication networks to a system of quantum-entangled channels that could not be intercepted, decoded, or even detected by any known alien technology. To the rest of the galaxy, humanity had vanished. In reality, they had never been more connected. Admiral Sam Grady stood on the bridge of the TFS Resolute and watched the final status reports come in. The Fifth Fleet, which had arrived from the Sigma Reach sector, was in position. The Seventh Fleet, pulled from patrol duty along the Outer Rim, was in position. 814 warships, organized into 3 strike groups, each approaching the Orion Veil from a different vector. Colonel Danny Harmon was still inside the blockade zone, hidden behind the moon of Haven's Rest with his 6 stealth frigates. For weeks, Lieutenant Nora Perry had been feeding him a constant stream of data on the Coalition fleet, and now that data was about to be put to use. "Status on the disruption pods?" Harmon asked. Perry checked her display. All 48 pods are in position, deployed along the Hillori relay network over the last 72 hours. They are dormant and undetected. And the Hillori drone carriers, still operating on the same 3 central relay nodes. They have not changed their network architecture at all. If we take out those nodes, their entire drone fleet loses coordination. 3,000 drones become 3,000 pieces of floating scrap. Harmon nodded. This was the part he had planned most carefully. The Hillori drones were the biggest threat in the Coalition fleet. Each one was small, fast, and expendable, and in large numbers they could overwhelm even the heaviest warship. But they were only dangerous when they were connected to the Hive network. Without that network, they were blind and stupid, capable of nothing more than drifting in whatever direction they had been pointed when the signal cut out. "On my mark," Harmon said. "Not before." He waited. He ate a meal he did not taste, drank coffee he did not enjoy, and sat in the command chair of his tiny frigate, staring at a tactical display that showed 80 alien warships and 3,000 drones arranged in a formation that was about to become very, very obsolete. The signal came from Admiral Grady at precisely 0300 hours, Terran Standard Time. A single word on the quantum channel: execute. Harmon looked at Perry. She was already reaching for the activation switch. "Do it," he said. Perry pressed the switch. 48 disruption pods activated simultaneously, flooding the Hillori relay network with a cascade of corrupted signals that tore through the drone command structure like a virus. The effect was instantaneous. Across the blockade zone, 3,000 Hillori drones lost contact with their carrier ships. Their formation lights flickered and went dark. Their engines sputtered. Some of them collided with each other. Others simply stopped moving and began to drift, dead in space. On the bridge of the nearest Hillori drone carrier, the hive mind cluster that served as the ship's commander, experienced something it had never felt before: silence. The constant hum of 3,000 connected units, the flow of data and coordination that defined its existence, was gone. It was alone in its own skull for the first time in its life. And the sensation was so alien and so terrifying that it did the only thing it could think of. It turned its ship around and ran. The other Hillary carriers followed within minutes. Vekthari As watched his tactical display with growing horror. Half his fleet had just evaporated. The drones were dead. The Hillary were retreating. The Varani had already pulled out days ago. He was alone with his Cathari warships, 42 vessels, against whatever the humans were about to throw at him. He did not have to wait long. The Terran Third Fleet emerged from faster-than-light transit directly ahead of his formation. 62 warships, led by the massive carrier TFS Resolute, dropped into real space in perfect alignment. Before Oz could react, the Fifth Fleet appeared on his left flank. 112 ships materializing out of nothing. And then the Seventh Fleet arrived on his right. Another 90 vessels closing the third side of a triangle that left the Cathari fleet surrounded on every axis. Military historians would later call it the Orion Cage. It was a maneuver that required 3 fleets to coordinate a simultaneous faster-than-light arrival from 3 different directions with split-second timing. And it had been executed so perfectly that not a single Terran ship was out of position. Vekthari As stared at his display. The numbers were overwhelming. Over 800 Terran warships, every single one of them with weapons locked and targeting solutions calculated. Arrayed around his 42 ships like a fist closing around a stone. Admiral Grady opened a single communication channel. His voice was calm and carried no emotion at all. "Commander As, you have 15 minutes to power down your weapons and withdraw your fleet from Terran claimed space. This is not a negotiation. There will be no second request." As gripped the edge of his command console. His officers looked at him, waiting for orders. Pride burned in his chest. He was Cathari. His species did not surrender. His species did not bow. "Hold position," he ordered. "All weapons hot." 13 minutes passed. Neither side moved. On the TFS Resolute, Grady watched the clock. Beside him, Colonel Harmon observed through a live feed from his frigate, inside the zone. Lieutenant Perry had her finger on a secondary weapons system, a targeting override that could illuminate every Cathari ship simultaneously. At 14 minutes, Grady looked at Harmon through the screen. Harmon nodded. Perry activated the targeting system. The forward batteries of the TFS Resolute fired a single volley. 2 plasma rounds screened across the void and passed within 200 meters of the spine of Cathar. Close enough that the energy wash scorched the hull plating and set off proximity alarms across every deck. The rounds did not hit. They were meant to show Vekthari As exactly what would happen next if he did not stand down. As looked at the scorch marks on his hull readout. He looked at the 800 warships surrounding him. He looked at the faces of his bridge crew. Young officers, most of them, with families on the Cathari homeworld. He thought about pride. He thought about duty. And then he thought about the 42 ships under his command, and the thousands of soldiers on board who would die in the next 60 seconds if he gave the wrong order. Vekthari As closed his eyes. When he opened them, his voice was steady. All ships, power down weapons, set course for Cathari space. The blockade was over. Not a single life had been lost. On his tiny frigate behind the moon, Colonel Harmon let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like an hour. Beside him, Perry leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. "That," she said quietly, "was the longest 15 minutes of my life." Harmon almost smiled. "Wait until you see the paperwork." The galaxy did not sleep well that night. News of the Orion Cage spread faster than light itself. Every species with a functioning intelligence service had been watching, and those that had not were informed within hours by those that had. The details varied depending on who was telling the story, but the core facts were always the same. The humans had gone dark, sprung a trap, with 3 fleets arriving from 3 directions with impossible precision, crippled 3,000 Halori drones in seconds without firing a shot, and then forced the Cathari to stand down with a single warning volley. No one had died. That was the part that kept the alien strategists awake. It would have been easier to understand if the humans had simply destroyed the Cathari fleet. Destruction was familiar. Every species in the galaxy understood what it meant when a stronger force crushed a weaker one. But the humans had chosen not to. They had held 800 warships in perfect kill positions around 42 enemy vessels and had chosen mercy. And that choice communicated something far more terrifying than any display of violence ever could. It said, "We could have. We decided not to. Do not make us decide again." On the Cathari homeworld, the political fallout was swift and brutal. Ambassador Zorath Vel was recalled from Threshold Station within 48 hours of the blockade's collapse. He arrived home to find that the Cathari High Command had already begun distancing itself from his actions. The intercepted communications that Megan Cole had presented to the Council, proving that the entire Orion Vale motion had been a resource grab, were now public knowledge across the galaxy. Zorath Vel had not just failed, he had been exposed, and in Cathari politics, exposure was worse than defeat. He was stripped of his diplomatic rank and reassigned to an administrative post on a minor colony world. It was not technically punishment. Officially, it was described as a lateral transfer. But everyone knew what it meant. Zorath Vel would spend the rest of his career filing reports in a gray office on a planet no one cared about. And he would do so knowing that his name had become a synonym for arrogance in every diplomatic academy in the galaxy. The Halori Collective reacted differently. The hive mind did not experience shame the way organic species did, but it understood failure in mathematical terms, and the numbers were devastating. Their entire drone network, their primary military asset, had been neutralized in under 30 seconds by a handful of small Terran frigates using technology the Halori had not even known existed. The Collective immediately began a complete overhaul of their military architecture, shifting from centralized drone control to distributed autonomous systems that could not be taken down by a single disruption attack. It would take them years to complete the transition, and during that time, they were effectively defenseless. They knew it. Everyone knew it. The Varani trade empire, ever practical, wasted no time in turning the situation to their advantage. Trade Lord Shenik had pulled his ships from the blockade before the fighting started, which meant the Varani had technically never been in direct conflict with humanity. Within a week of the standoff's resolution, Shenik dispatched a trade delegation to Earth, with a proposal for a new long-term economic partnership. The terms were generous, more generous than anything the Varani had offered any species in decades. President Beckett reviewed the proposal, made a few modifications, and signed it. The Varani were opportunists, but they were reliable opportunists. And right now, reliable was valuable. On Threshold Station, the Galactic Council convened a special session to address the aftermath. The chamber was full. Every seat was occupied. Delegates who had skipped sessions for years were suddenly present, sitting upright and paying attention in a way they had not done since the last major galactic crisis, which had been almost a century ago. There was a tension in the air that was not quite fear and not quite respect, but was something new, something that the older species recognized as the moment when the balance of power shifts, and everyone knows it, but no one wants to say it out loud. Megan Cole walked to the central platform. She wore a simple dark suit, the same kind President Beckett had worn for her broadcast. No medals, no symbols of power. She carried no data devices, no prepared statements, no visual displays. She simply stood in the center of the largest diplomatic chamber in the known galaxy and spoke. Members of the Council, I will be brief, because I believe that the events of the past week have spoken more clearly than any words I could offer. 11 years ago, humanity was given a seat in this chamber. We were told it was an honor. We were told it was a privilege. We accepted it as both, and we have spent every year since trying to be good neighbors in a galaxy we were only beginning to understand. We built colonies on worlds that no one else wanted. We traded fairly. We shared technology. When the Rathani pirates attacked a convoy carrying citizens of 4 different species, it was a human ship that stayed behind to fight, while the others escaped. When the Pelothi orbital platform suffered a reactor failure, it was human engineers who volunteered for the repair mission that everyone else said was too dangerous. We did these things not because we wanted something in return, but because that is who we are. Humanity is not a perfect species. We have our flaws, our failures, and our history of mistakes. But we have always believed that you earn your place not by what you take, but by what you give. What happened in the Orion Veil was not what we wanted. We did not want to move our fleets. We did not want to go dark. We did not want to surround a foreign military force and make them choose between retreat and destruction. We did those things because 2 million of our people, families, children, people who had never harmed anyone, were surrounded by warships and cut off from the rest of civilization for no reason other than the greed of a few. I stand before you today not to gloat and not to threaten. I stand here to say one thing clearly, so that there is no misunderstanding going forward. Humanity will never again allow another species to decide where we can live, where we can go, or who we can be. Our hand is open to anyone who wishes to be our friend. Our door is open to anyone who wishes to trade, to learn, or to build something together. But let me be clear, that hand can close, and that door can lock. And if we are forced to defend our people again, we will do so without hesitation and without apology. She paused and looked across the silent chamber. We are not asking for permission to exist. We are informing you that we do. The chamber was so quiet that the soft hum of the station's life support systems was audible. No one spoke. No one moved. 412 civilizations sat in absolute stillness and absorbed what had just been said. Then, High Speaker Draven rose from his seat. The ancient amphibian moved slowly, as he always did, each step deliberate and careful. He descended from his elevated platform and walked across the chamber floor to where Megan Cole stood. The distance was not far, but at his age, every step was a statement. Delegates watched in confusion, then in astonishment, as Draven stopped in front of the human ambassador and placed both of his webbed hands together in front of his chest, fingers pointing upward, and bowed his head. It was the Draven acknowledgement, a gesture of profound respect, that the High Speaker had not given to any species in over 100 standard years. The last time he had performed it was for the Navori, after they had brokered a peace that ended a war spanning 3 star systems. It was not a gesture of submission. It was a gesture that said, I see what you are, and I recognize your place among us. Megan Cole, who had negotiated with liars and manipulators and warlords for 6 years without flinching, felt her throat tighten. She bowed her head in return. Back on Earth, President Beckett held one final meeting in the Oval Command Room. Admiral Grady and Colonel Harmon sat across from her, both of them showing the exhaustion of weeks of sustained crisis management. The Varani trade deal is signed, Beckett said. The Dravosi have formally requested a military exchange program, and 12 other species have reached out through back channels to discuss closer ties. And the Cathari? Grady asked. Quiet, for now. Beckett folded her hands on the table. This is not over, Sam. What we did in the Orion Veil changed the equation, but it did not solve it. Every species in the galaxy is now recalculating what humanity means. Some of them will want to be our friends because of what they saw. Others will want to be our enemies for the same reason. Then we will be ready for both, Grady said. Beckett nodded and turned to Harmon. Colonel, on behalf of the Federation, thank you. Your service was extraordinary. Harmon shifted in his chair. He was not comfortable with praise, and never had been. I just did the job, Madam President. Perry and the recon teams did the real work. Lieutenant Perry has been promoted to commander and assigned to lead a new rapid response division, Grady said. She does not know it yet. Harmon almost smiled. She will be good at it. He left Colorado Springs the next morning and flew back to Montana. His ranch was exactly the way he had left it. Quiet, dusty, and smelling of hay and pine. His horses were glad to see him. He spent the afternoon fixing a fence that had come loose in a recent storm. And by evening, he was sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun go down behind the mountains. He thought about Vectharios, sitting on the bridge of his dreadnought and choosing to stand down. He thought about the look on the Cathari commander's face when he realized that mercy was being offered rather than demanded. He hoped Oz understood what that meant. Most people did not until much later. On Haven's Rest, life had returned to normal with surprising speed. Supply ships arrived within hours of the blockade's collapse, carrying food, medicine, and enough building materials to last 6 months. Schools reopened. Markets reopened. The farmers went back to their fields, because crops did not care about galactic politics, and needed tending regardless of who was in orbit. On a warm evening 3 weeks after the standoff, a young girl named Katie Walsh stood in her backyard and looked up at the sky. The stars were coming out one by one, strange and beautiful, and nothing like the stars she had seen in pictures of Earth's sky. She had been too young to fully understand what had happened during the blockade, but she knew that something important had changed. She could feel it in the way the adults talked now, quieter, steadier, as if they had been through a storm and come out the other side. "Dad," she said, "are the aliens still mad at us?" Her father Ben stood beside her, his arm around her small shoulders. He looked up at the same sky, the vast, impossible, endlessly beautiful sky, and thought about all the species out there. Some of them afraid, some of them curious, some of them angry, and some of them, maybe for the first time, willing to see humanity not as newcomers or threats, but as neighbors. Some of them are, he said, but that is their problem, not ours. High above them, invisible against the darkness, a single Dravasi warship held station in a quiet orbit. War Chief Katan stood on his bridge with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the little world below. He had told the council he was passing through the sector on routine patrol. No one had believed him. No one had challenged him either. He opened a private channel. It connected after a single pulse. "Ambassador Cole," he said. "Katan here." "War Chief." Megan's voice was warm, even through the static of a long-range transmission. "What can I do for you?" "My people have been talking. We have been watching what your species did, and we have decided something." "And what is that?" "We would like to know you better. Properly. Not as council delegates sitting across a table, but as allies. Perhaps even as friends." Megan smiled in her small office on Threshold Station. Through the window, the nebula glowed in shades of violet and gold, and the lights of 100 alien ships moved slowly across the darkness, like fireflies on a summer night. "Then come have dinner with us, Katan. That is how humans start all their best friendships." There was a pause, and then a sound that the translation software struggled to interpret. A low, rumbling noise from deep in the Dravosi war chief's chest. It took a moment for the system to identify it. It was laughter. Across the galaxy, in war rooms and council chambers and quiet offices, strategists and diplomats and leaders of every species were doing the same thing. Recalculating, reassessing, and wondering what came next. The humans were no longer the newcomers. They were no longer the curiosity. They were the species that had gone silent, sprung a trap without firing a killing shot, and made one of the oldest military powers in the galaxy stand down, with nothing more than precision, preparation, and the unshakable will to protect their own. The galaxy was the same size it had always been, but it felt smaller now, and the humans felt larger, and somewhere in the vast dark between the stars, a new order was quietly taking shape. Not through conquest, not through fear, but through the simple, stubborn, impossibly human refusal to be told that they did not belong. They belonged, and now everyone knew it. The chamber was enormous. It stretched upward like the inside of a hollow mountain, ringed with thousands of seats carved from pale stone that glowed faintly with embedded light. Each seat belonged to a delegate, and each delegate belonged to a species, and each species believed it had earned its place among the stars. 412 civilizations were represented in the Galactic Council. And on this particular day, every single one of them was watching a tall, insectoid creature step up to the central platform and begin to speak. His name was Zorath Vel, and he was the ambassador of the Cathari Dominion. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, with a segmented body covered in dark chitinous plates that clicked softly when he moved. His voice was sharp and carried well through the chamber's natural acoustics, though most delegates relied on the translation devices embedded in their seats. The species known as humans, Zorath Vel began, his mandibles clicking between words, have held a seat on this council for only 11 standard years. In that time, they have expanded into 14 star systems, established 37 permanent colonies, and constructed a military fleet that now rivals civilizations 10 times their age. This is not the behavior of a peaceful species finding its place. This is the behavior of a species preparing for conquest. He paused to let the murmur ripple through the chamber. He was good at pauses. He had practiced this speech for weeks. I propose that the Council revoke humanity's colonization rights in the Orion Vale sector, effective immediately. The resources of that region must not fall into the hands of a species we do not yet fully understand. The murmur became a roar. Delegates argued with one another across the aisles. Some nodded in agreement. Others shook their heads or made the equivalent gestures of their species. High Speaker Draven, an ancient amphibian with mottled green skin and heavy-lidded golden eyes, raised one webbed hand, and the chamber slowly fell silent. Draven had presided over this council for longer than most of the delegates had been alive. When he raised his hand, people listened. "The motion has been presented," Draven said in a voice like water moving over smooth stones. "We will vote." The vote was close. The elder races, the Cathari, the Helori Collective, the Navori Ascendancy, voted in favor. Many younger species abstained, unwilling to pick a side. A handful voted against, but not enough. The motion passed by a margin of 31 votes. Humanity had just been told where it could and could not go. 12 hours later, the news reached Earth. President Laura Beckett read the Council's ruling on a glass display screen in the Oval Command Room, a fortified chamber buried deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. She was 57 years old, with short gray hair, and the kind of calm face that made people trust her in a crisis. She had served 20 years in the Terran Navy before entering politics. and she had learned a long time ago that the worst thing a leader could do in a moment like this was react too quickly. She set the display down and looked at the two people sitting across from her. Admiral Sam Grady was a big man with wide shoulders and a shaved head. He had commanded fleets in 3 different sectors and had a reputation for being impossible to rattle. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table, but his jaw was tight. Megan Cole was the opposite, small, sharp-featured, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was the Terran Federation's diplomatic envoy to the Galactic Council, and had spent the last 6 years navigating the politics of Threshold Station. She knew every trick, every alliance, and every grudge that moved through that chamber. "They are testing us," Megan said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "If we accept this, it will not stop with the Orion Veil. Next they will restrict our trade routes, then our military patrol zones, then our seat on the Council itself. The Cathari have done this before to younger species. They squeeze slowly until you have nothing left." Admiral Grady nodded. "She is right, Madam President. This is not about the Orion Veil. This is about whether humanity rolls over or stands up." Laura Beckett leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. The room was silent, except for the low hum of the ventilation system. "What do we have in the region?" she asked. "The 3rd Fleet is stationed at Callaway Base, about 4 days from the Orion Veil border," Grady said. 62 warships, including the carrier group led by the TFS Resolute, fully supplied and combat-ready. "I do not want to start a war, Sam." "Neither do I, but I want them to know we can." Beckett turned to Megan. "File a formal protest through every diplomatic channel we have. Make it loud. Make sure every species on that council knows we are not accepting this quietly." Megan nodded. "And if they ignore it, then we will have a different conversation." Beckett looked at Grady. "Move the 3rd Fleet to a holding position near the Orion Veil border. No aggressive maneuvers. No weapons hot. I want them visible, not threatening." Grady stood and straightened his uniform. "Understood." After they left, Laura Beckett sat alone in the command room for a long time. She thought about the colonies in the Orion Veil. Nearly 2 million people living on 3 different worlds. Farmers, engineers, teachers, children. People who had left Earth to build something new under alien skies. She had promised them that the Federation would always protect them. She intended to keep that promise. That night, across a dozen Terran colony worlds, something began to change. It was not dramatic. There were no speeches, no alarms, no soldiers marching through the streets. It was quieter than that. A comm signal here, a classified order there. Shipyard managers who had been running skeleton crews received new instructions. Furnaces that had been cold for months were relit. Dry docks that held half-finished hulls were suddenly flooded with workers pulling double shifts. On the colony world of New Helena, a shipyard foreman named Greg Dawson stood on a catwalk overlooking the massive frame of an unfinished destroyer. He had been told 3 months ago that the project was on hold indefinitely. Now he held a new order in his hand that said the ship needed to be finished in 90 days. He looked out across the yard. The lights were coming on, one section at a time, spreading across the facility like a slow sunrise. Workers were arriving in transports, pulling on their gear, heading to their stations, without being told twice. Greg had been in the Navy once, a long time ago. He knew what this looked like. He had seen it before. Not the panic of a species caught off guard, but the slow, deliberate gathering of strength by a people who had decided they would not be pushed. He folded the order, tucked it into his pocket, and walked down to the factory floor to get to work. Across the stars, in the gleaming halls of Threshold Station, Ambassador Zorath Vel celebrated his political victory with his allies. He spoke confidently about how the humans would complain for a while and then accept their place. They were young, he said. They would learn. He did not notice the quiet message that Megan Cole sent to 6 different delegations that evening. He did not see the Dravosi war chief read it and smile with all of his teeth. He did not know that in the deepest level of a mountain on Earth, a woman with gray hair and steady hands was already thinking 3 moves ahead. The galaxy had made its decision about humanity. Humanity was about to make its own.